My name is Alan Moore. I am a writer and magician, and all of my life thus far I have lived in Northampton. Northampton is a town that is at the economic, geographic and historic dead centre of England, and to a degree this town is my territory.
I think my ambition from an early age was to be a superhero. I remember that I got my mum to make me a costume and I got the mask, and I went and hid in a tree and waited till some of my friends walked past, and then I jumped down wearing the mask and the Star-Spangled costume, and they knew who I was. They said, "Oh, hello, Alan." And I said, "I am not Alan Mortals, I'm the defender of justice and decency." But I could never understand that. I mean, because all Superman has to do is to take off his glasses and comb his hair and nobody recognises him, you know. But that was my first ambition. When I realised that I probably couldn't be a superhero because of this mask problem, I thought that I'd probably prefer to be somebody who wrote or drew superheroes.
One of the comments that I received most frequently upon the publication of the book Voice of the Fire that I wrote about Northampton was an accusation of exaggeration, placing too much importance upon a town whose only real relevance would seem to be to me. I had people who were saying, "Yes, but you could say this about any town," which is actually rather the point. If you can look beneath the surface, beneath the flagstones of Northampton, and find something magical, something wonderful, then yes, of course, that means that wherever you are, you could do the same excavation. You could find the meaning of the place in which you will probably be spending a great deal of your life.
The spot where I'm currently standing is still a part of the boroughs, the oldest and most central part of ancient Northampton, built next to the castle, which was itself replaced by Castle Station. The areas around here were originally outlying fortifications of the castle. The place has a special association for me. This is the place where my grandmother's council house stood, and where I lived for the first 17 years of my life, until the slum clearances, whereby it wasn't so much that the land was needed for anything else, it was just that the people were a nuisance. It was an evacuation. They were moving non-profitable people away from a potentially profitable neighbourhood.
Magic, I've come to realise, is not an escape into some fabulous nether dimension, some marvellous mystical dream world populated with extraordinary creatures. Yes, there are extraordinary creatures and strange dream landscapes that are very much a part of magic, but magic, more than this, to me, is a new way of seeing our own world.
The introduction of the automobile changed everything about our society. It irrevocably changed our way of life, and you might say our way of death. One of the very first automobile murderers was a gentleman named Alfie Rouse. Alfie Rouse had been born upon Herne Hill in London, and by all accounts had been during his youth a relatively shy, retiring man. This changed when he was sent away to the First World War. He received terrible shrapnel wounds at Givenchy, and when he returned, by then already married to the sweetheart that he'd married just before going away to war, he was a ruthless, persistent womanizer. Alfie Rouse travelled around the land, accumulating girlfriends, wives, babies, all of this unknown to the family that he already had back in London. It all started to get a little too much for him. He was an underwear salesman. His salary was not a low salary by the standards of the day, but it wasn't enough to keep 2 or 3 separate families. On bonfire night, November the 5th, 1930, he picked up a hitchhiker. The man was probably drunk and may have been fairly insensible by the time that Rouse turned into a field near Hardingstone, just outside Northampton. At this point, Rouse probably hit the man to make sure that he remained unconscious, and then, after disconnecting the fuel leads from his car to try and make this look like it might have been some form of accident, he set fire to the car with the man inside it. I think the plan was that the body would be taken for Rouse's and he would be able to escape this encumbering identity with all of its wives and its children and its debts. It wasn't a very well conceived or well executed plan. Rouse was picked up very soon thereafter. He'd travelled to see another of his families in Wales, and then when pictures of the burnt out car were being shown in the newspapers, had little choice but to go to London to face the music. He was brought to Northampton and he was incarcerated in this cell under the Guildhall in the centre of the town. Rouse, with his salesman's patter and with his womanising charm, apparently believed right until the last moment that he would be so persuasive, so endearing to the jury that they couldn't do anything but acquit him. This didn't turn out to be the case. Rouse was kept in this cell until the morning in 1931 that he was taken out to Bedford Prison, where he was hung. This is my house, this is my garden. It's slap in the middle of an area of Northampton that's called Phippsville. Now, it's called this because of the brewer and industrialist Pickering Phipps. Pickering Phipps, at the turn of the century, was responsible for most of the industry in Northampton and nearly all of the pubs. He had a foundry up at the Iron Age camp on Hunsbury Hill, where he actually destroyed most of the camp itself, digging up the iron that he was going to use to build the railway when the castle that stood up on the site that the railway was intended for was finally demolished and pulled down. Phipps was, in the later years of his life, a God-fearing man. He was starting to worry about his chances of actual salvation or getting into heaven. He believed that having created so many public houses, he was almost certainly destined for hell. For that reason, he created an estate, this one, where there are 4 churches and no public houses. Like I say, the official name for the estate is Phippsville. The locals quickly christened it Phipps Fire Escape, as this was his rope ladder out of the flames. Whether it succeeded or not, I suppose we shall never know.
Magic has quite a lot in common with fiction and with fantasy. We almost get to the notion that the two are pretty well interchangeable. I think that Aleister Crowley even mentioned that the language of magic is more about language than it is about magic. The idea of a grimoire, a dark book of spells. Grimoire is simply another way of spelling grammar. According to Crowley, to cast a spell is simply to spell. When we think of the fact that most of the magic gods that various cultures have created or worshipped in the past, characters like Hermes, Mercury, Thoth, these are not only the gods of magic, they are also the scribe gods. They are the gods of writing. To some degree, the reason that I involved myself with magic was partly because, as a writer, I was feeling that something to do with the territory of writing itself. The way that anybody who's been writing for a given length of time will probably have anecdotes to tell you. Strange little coincidences. Things that they wrote and then something very similar happened to them, perhaps a day, perhaps a month, perhaps 10 years later. That there are these odd little incidents that tend to build up and that you tend to shove in a filing drawer just marked weird stuff. And eventually, as with myself, you might reach a point where you perhaps decide that the stuff in the drawer marked weird stuff is in fact the only important stuff, and that if you wish to progress as a writer beyond mere technique, then you might be advised to start looking at some of those events. By magic, I mean basically what everybody means by magic. I mean a rabbit out of a hat. I mean something emerging demonstrably from nothing. So to a certain degree, in that I would include our physical universe emerging from a single point in a quantum vacuum. I would include any human thought or idea or work of art which demonstrably starts out nowhere, starts out in the silence of our minds. First there is no idea, then there is the flickering of an idea, then there is a fully realised idea, and then finally we have a physical artifact which we can hold in our hands. We have a book, we have a painting. This to me is a magical act. Any act of creation is a magical act, which is probably why I tend to express most of my magical thinking in terms of creative acts. If I can turn it into a piece of writing or a set of images or a performance so that other people can share the information concerning that realm, then to me that is part of what a magician's job is.
This church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Sheep Street, Northampton, is one of the oldest churches in England. The church itself is a repository of mystery. The round of the church is built above large tombs or vaults that are also circular. The vaults are meant to represent the cave at Gethsemane, where Jesus Christ went through his 3-day bed-peace lying, while the actual round of the church represents his resurrection. There is an oblong building growing out from the round. This is known as the martyrium and represents the martyrdom of Jesus. The vault is the most mysterious element of these three elements which make up the church, in that it is known to be there, it is known to exist. Stamp on the flagstones inside the church and they ring hollow. However, there is no entrance to it. The vault exists, but it has not been seen probably for hundreds and hundreds of years. However, the walls of the church are very, very thick, 4 or 5 feet in places. There is a persistent rumour amongst the various sextons who've worked in the building that there are corridors within the walls, and that these possibly grant access to the hidden vault. There's an interesting anecdote that goes back, I believe, to the 1980s, when workmen who were digging in nearby Church Street broke through the wall of a trench to find that they had a draft blowing through and an empty space beyond. They had almost certainly stumbled into the sealed and unseen vaults of the Holy Sepulchre. This obviously was a cause of some excitement for the vicar who was in residence then. He rushed down the next morning to get a first historic glimpse of these vaults, only to find that the council had a work gang come out overnight and cement up the hole in the side of the trench, thus sealing up the vaults forever.
From our earliest times, we very quickly get the idea that the only lineages and lives worth recording are those of the aristocracy. If two aristocrats get married, or have a falling out, or the start of war, then this is of immense value. The lives of the ordinary people are overlooked. They are reduced historically to a huge faceless crowd of extras who don't get a speaking part in history. Whereas in fact, the stories, the rumours, the family legends, the family secrets, these tell a rich, incredibly deep, incredibly colourful story.
One of the older churches of the town is St. Peter's Church. It was around, I believe, the year 1060, perhaps slightly earlier, that certain circumstances took place here, which has almost enshrined the church in legend. At the time, there was, at the gate of the church, a lame beggar woman who would sit by the gate each day collecting alms. Also in the church was a semi-retarded lad, a village idiot type, who would help the parish priest, a man called Brunning, to tend his vegetable gardens. The simple-minded youth was apparently given to visions. In one of these visions, St. Peter had appeared to him and told him to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome. This he attempted to do, but according to the story, having 3 times attempted to board the boat for Rome, 3 times he was driven back by a force, something that he described as being almost like an angel. He returned to Northampton, having had a direct message from supernatural forces that there was a friend of God entombed beneath the church. In those days, people perhaps paid more attention to visions than in our later era. The priest was anyway so impressed by the vision that he and the lad went into the church and began to prise up the flagstones to see what might be underneath. The crippled woman from the gate dragged herself into the church to see what it was that they discovered. According to the story, when they prized up the final flagstone, a great light burst out from underneath, which turned out to be the resting place of the bones of Saint Ragina, who was the brother of Saint Edmund. The 2 saints had been martyred in November within days of each other, and somehow the bones of Ragina had ended up buried beneath St. Peter's Church. At the moment of their unearthing, as I say, there was alleged to be a supernatural light which filled the church, and the Holy Spirit, in the form of a bird, was said to have flown around the church 3 times, sprinkling holy water or some form of supernatural dew from its wings. At this, the lame beggar woman was said to have raised herself up and walked, although in my account of the story given in my novel, I suggested that she probably got up and ran. In the early 1700s, at the very crack of the 18th century, there were 2 women living in Northampton in the village of Oundle. Their names were Eleanor Shaw and Mary Phillips. They were both young women, apparently quite attractive women. They were also burned as witches in 1705. As far as I know, the last witches to be burned in the whole of Europe. There's some interesting things about this particular case. One of them is the youth and apparent beauty of the 2 women condemned. This is a far cry from the standard medieval picture of the witch as a toothless howling crone. You start to come to the conclusion that maybe attractive women were hung and burned and pilloried because
this was a long time before easily available adult video hire. If someone wanted some titillation at the weekend, they just didn't have the options that we have now. They couldn't get Electric Blue volumes 1 through 5. They had to go and watch someone in the stocks, or somebody kicking at the end of a rope, or somebody frying on a bonfire. Now, when things started to go wrong for Mary and Eleanor was around the time when a local woman who had been widowed and was thus without a man in her bed had complained of this to the two witches, who promised that they would send her something to ease her frustration and her longing. What they sent her was apparently, by her own account, 2 strange, blind, mole-like animals who shared her bed with her and, I'm quoting here, suckled her nether parts front and back. She was apparently so alarmed by this that after 3 or 4 nights of it, she alerted the local minister, one Parson Danks. Now, why I personally am uncertain as to whether these just were 2 victimised women or whether they might not have been involved in some sort of magical operation, is the reports that come after their arrest. These are not the hysterical crucible type reports from sort of adolescent girls who are anxious for attention or whatever. These are reports of things seen by numerous people after the witches had been imprisoned. They were hung to almost the point of death, and then were tied to the stake and burned. When I was younger, my mother told me that I should never call somebody a bastard because they might really be one. Perhaps you could extend that to say that you should never accuse somebody of being a witch for exactly the same reason. Everywhere that we live is surrounded by these fascinating fragments of history. They are embedded in it. These fantastic vanished personalities, these legends, these romances. These things, although they are embedded in the past, are very much a part of the fabric of all of our lives. And if we wish to live in that world of legend, rather than in this somewhat sorry and fallen tabloid world which we've had dished up to us, then we have to be prepared to excavate. We have to be prepared to look below the surface of our lives and find that rich coal seam of meaning and history that underlies our entire experience.